One of the most simple and effective strategies in chess is an all-out charge against the opposing king. Some niggling positional players may dismiss this kind of play as being primitive, but the very same players will quake in their boots when they see you marshalling your forces for the attack. On this video, I'm going to show you how to create devastating build-ups against the enemy king right out of the opening, and in which an understanding of where the pieces and pawns should be placed will be more important than any knowledge of theory. Before anyone complains that such a single-minded approach can't possibly be good, let me show you just how devastating it can be. Let's look first of all at the old-fashioned Italian game, or guaico piano, which I'm sure every chess player has had in his career. e4, Black replies with e5, White brings his knight out with knight f3, Black defends the pawn on e5 with knight c6, White plays his bishop to an aggressive diagonal with bishop c4, and Black replies in the same way with bishop c5. White now develops this bishop on c1 with d3, and Black develops his king's knight with knight f6. Now let's suppose for a moment that White doesn't play what's probably the best move with knight out to c3, and instead plays the perfectly natural castles. Black plays pawn to d6, and now let's suppose that White plays his bishop out to g5, again something that looks like a perfectly natural move. Black hits this bishop on g5 with h6, and now White retreats the bishop to h4. Well, you may wonder what can possibly be wrong with that, but in fact it's probably a decisive mistake. Black lashes out with the move g5, and after bishop g3 follows up with a tremendously powerful move h5. The threat is now to play h4, trapping this bishop on g3. So White really has to do something quite sharp in order to try and get out of this mess. If he plays knight on f3 takes g5, then Black can play a spectacular move with h4 in any case, ignoring this threat to the f7 pawn. Now if White plays knight takes f7, Black can play a really spectacular move. h4 takes g3, sacrificing the queen on d8. White has to take this queen now, there's no other way out. So knight takes d8 is forced, and then Black can uncork a spectacular quiet move with bishop on c8 out to g4, hitting this queen on d1. The best move for the queen is queen d2, after which Black follows up with another quiet move, knight out to d4. I'm sure you're wondering if this can possibly be enough for a whole queen, but I can assure you that it is. It turns out that Black's kingside attack is actually winning. If, for example, White plays his knight out to c3, there follows knight f3 check, throwing another piece onto the bonfire, and after g takes f3, Black plays bishop takes f3, which threatens to play g takes h2 mate. If white meets this with hg, which is really the only defence against gh, then black's rook screams down the board, rook h1, mate. If instead of knight c3, white tries to fend off the threat, say with h3, then black can play knight into e2 check. White can't play queen takes e2 because he'll be behind in material, so he has to go king h1. And then the crowning glory of black's attack is rook takes h3 check. And after gh, which is forced, he goes bishop f3 mate. I think you'll agree with me that this is a really beautiful and surprising combination. And what, you may ask, did white really do wrong? Let's suppose your opponent plays the Ruy Lopez or Spanish opening against you with e4, e5, knight out to f3, attacking this pawn on e5, knight c6, and now bishop out to b5, renewing the pressure on e5 by putting pressure on the knight on c6. Many people assume that playing black in the Spanish is just an unpleasant defensive task, but there are some electrifying ideas at black's disposal that many people don't know about. Before setting up an attacking formation, black should first of all make sure that his centre is secure, and for this I suggest that you play a6, and after bishop a4, go d6, supporting this pawn on e5. In Dirty Tricks 1, I showed that after castles, black can play his bishop out to g4 and meet h3 with a surprising h5 when white daren't take this bishop on g4. If white gets wise to this and instead of playing castling goes c3 first, then black has some other ideas. In a half-forgotten game against Kots in the 1961 Soviet Championship, Boris Spassky played his knight out to f6, white castled, Spassky played bishop e7, which all looks rather normal standard Spanish play, white defended the pawn on e4 with rook e1, and now Spassky did something slightly unusual by bringing his bishop on c8 out to g4. White should probably meet this with d3 followed by knight bd2. But most whites are going to be tempted into kicking this bishop from g4 with h3. Spassky dropped his bishop back to h5, and after Kots played d3, he played another surprising move with queen d7. White innocently played the natural move knight bd2, and now see if you can think what Spassky did on his next move. In fact, he unleashed the move g5, suddenly building up an attack against white's king, and by now Kots was probably bitterly regretting the fact that he'd played his pawn to h3. The threat is to prise open lines on the king side with g4, in conjunction with castling queenside. In order to prevent this, Kots decided that his best option under the circumstances was to play g4 himself, but this weakens his king side quite considerably. Spassky dropped his bishop back to g6, and after Kots rushed to bring over defenders for his king with knight f1, Spassky took a can opener to white's king side with h5 and had a very strong attacking position. Instead of Kots's d3, white played much more aggressively in a game Kondu-Nicolin from the women's zonal tournament in Pula 1990. Kondu played d4, which is the recommended procedure of meeting flank pressure with a counterblow in the centre. Black broke the pin on the knight on c6 by going b5, and after bishop b3, black went queen d7, Again, a similar move to the one that Spassky played against Kotz. White played d5, which is natural enough. Black's knight went out to a5, hitting the bishop on b3, and this bishop dropped back to c2. Once again, Black lashed out on the king's side with g5, which seems quite impossible now because White can simply take it. Bishop takes g5. But Black then played rook h8 to g8, hitting the bishop on g5 because the knight on f3 is pinned to the queen on d1. White no doubt thought she was getting out of this by playing bishop takes f6. And if Black plays bishop takes f6, White can do something like king h1. However, Black refused to take back this bishop on f6, and instead played queen takes h3, threatening mate on g2. White no doubt thought that she still had things under control, and went knight on f3 to g5, which blocks the attack of the rook on g8, and threatens Black's queen on h3. But little could she have realised what was going to happen next. Black uncorked the unbelievable move, queen takes g2 check. White has obviously got no choice but to take the queen with king takes g2. And now Black took White's queen on d1, bishop takes d1. White recaptured on d1, rook takes d1. And now Black, after bishop takes f6, also showed that White is going to lose the knight on g5 as well. The net result of all this mayhem is that White ended up a pawn down in the endgame, and Black went on to win. Just in case anyone thinks this kind of chess is a bit speculative, then I should point out that the Hungarian Grandmaster Lajos Portis, a paragon of respectability and for many years his country's leading player, has also played this kind of strategy. After White castles kingside, Portis has shown a fondness for the move bishop e7, which may seem innocent enough. But after rook e1, his idea is to play the amazing g5, which starts a flank attack and also threatens g4, winning the knight on f3. After c3, Portis has preferred the plan bishop d7, d4, knight ge7, which intends to bring the knight to g6, supporting this e5 pawn once again. In a game from Linares 1990, Nigel Short now tried bishop b3 against Portis, which has got the idea of knight out to g5, hitting the f7 pawn. Black defended against this with h6. Nigel Short developed his queen's knight with knight bd2, being careful not to castle too early. Black brought his knight out to g6. And now White played knight out to c4, trying to put more pressure on this e5 pawn. Portis continued his development with bishop e7. White dropped his knight on c4 back to e3. And now Portis started inching up on White's king side with a move bishop out to g5. White took this bishop off, knight takes g5, after which Portis opened up the h-file with hg. Nigel Short wisely decided to prevent this knight on g6 hopping into the f4 square by going g3. Portis met this with a plan he'd used earlier in the tournament against his Hungarian compatriot Gyula Sachs. He played e takes d4, and after cd, the rather strange looking king f8. The point of this move is that Black wants to play his queen out to f6 without worrying about knight d5 takes c7 being check. The other point of this king f8 move is that it makes room for black's rook on a8 to eventually come over to the e8 square, putting pressure on this pawn on e4. After this move, king to f8, both Short and Sachs castle kingside for white, which is certainly a logical move. Against Sachs, Portisch now played his bishop out to h3. Sachs played the aggressive queen f3, threatening mate on f7. Portisch spotted this by going queen d7. White had to defend his pawn on d4, which is attacked by the knight on c6, and so he went rook d1, whereupon Portisch brought his rook on a8 over to this square e8. Sachs continued aggressively with knight into f5, but then Portisch counterattacked with the move g4, hitting the queen on f3. The queen came over to e3, and now black played rook h5, which threatens rook takes f5 because this pawn on e4 is pinned to the queen on e3. Sachs defended against this by dropping his knight back to h4, after which Portisch played rook takes h4, sacrificing the exchange, which is even stronger than taking with the knight. Sachs had to take back with gh. Portisch played knight takes h4, with ideas of bringing his knight into the f3 square. With the threats mounting, Sachs decided to try and defend this e4 pawn a bit better by going bishop into d5, which Portisch met very effectively by bringing his knight on c6 round to e7, threatening knight takes d5 because the pawn on e4 is pinned against the queen on e3. Sachs retreated his bishop to c4, whereupon Portisch got really clever with knight e to f5, once again exploiting this pin on the e4 pawn. Sachs had little choice but to move his queen. He went queen c3, and now rook takes e4 left white's position in ruins. Black has got two pawns for the exchange and a tremendous attacking position. In the later game against Nigel Short, Portisch refrained from his earlier bishop h3, which he used to beat Sachs, and instead brought his queen out to f6 with queen f6, hitting the pawn on d4. Short counterattacked with knight d5, and now Portisch lopped off the d4 pawn with queen takes d4. Short hit back by playing bishop takes g5, and now Portisch brought his knight on g6 into the attack with knight ge5, which incidentally threatens things like bishop g4. In order to try and fend off the threats against the light squares around his king, Nigel Short now played his bishop back to e3, and after queen takes d1, recaptured with his bishop on d1, which covers the f3 square. Unfortunately for him, things are already becoming rather serious, and now Portisch hit back with bishop out to h3, and after rook e1, his knight hopped into the d3 square. Short had no choice but to bring this rook to e2, whereupon Portisch brought another piece into the attack with knight c6 to e5, threatening, by the way, knight f3 check, king h1, bishop f1, which hits both the rook on e2 and threatens rook takes h2 mate. Short fended off this threat with rook d2, after which his bishop on d1 covers the f3 square. But then Portisch wormed his way further into white's camp by going knight on d3 to e1, which renews this knight f3 check threat. Things were so desperate for Nigel Short by this stage that he decided to surrender the exchange with f4. But after knight 1 to f3 check, king f2, knight takes d2, Portisch's technique was more than up to the job, and he won in just 35 moves. Before leaving this attacking formation, let me show you how the young American Grandmaster Patrick Wolf lost to an an unknown player called Castro in the Philadelphia Open of 1990. After a6, bishop a4, d6, Wolf played c3, and black went bishop d7, d4, knight g7, as in the two Portish games. White also repeated their play with bishop b3. Black went h6, stopping knight g5. White played knight bd2, and black brought his knight out to g6. Now instead of the knight c4, which we saw in those last two games, Wolf now played his knight out to f1, with the idea that after bishop e7 he could bring his knight out to g3 rather than the e3 square which we looked at in those last two games. Castro played bishop out to g5, and after bishop e3 he brought his bishop further into White's encampment with bishop f4. Wolf felt obliged to take this bishop off by going bishop takes f4, but in doing so he brought black's knight on g6 into the f4 square, where it was very dangerously placed. After the further moves castles, queen f6, rook e1, black sounded the charge with a move h5, which already announces a very aggressive policy of castling queenside. White's knight on g3 retreated to the f1 square, and now black in fact castled queenside, and on his next move followed up with g5 with a tremendous attack. This game may have seemed like a major upset at the time, but to my mind it's a classic example of the practical dirty tricks approach succeeding. In playing in such a way, you can up the odds even against very strong opponents. Another popular opening at club level is the quiet Vienna game, in which White plays knight out to c3 followed by g3, with which he wants an automatic attack eventually on the f-file with f4. Against this, I recommend that black once again uses a dirty tricks approach with knight out to c6, and when White goes g3 you play your bishop out to c5, and when he goes bishop g2 you start advancing on the king side with h5. This in fact is what Mariotti played against William Hartston in the 1972 Skopje Olympiad. Hartston no doubt thought he was defending against this threat of h4 when he brought his knight out to f3, but amazingly Mariotti did it anyway. h4. Hartston no doubt wondered what was going on, and he played knight takes h4, but then Mariotti flashed out rook takes h4, sacrificing the exchange. Hartston had no choice but to take this rook with gh, and now queen takes h4, threatened mate with queen takes f2. It was probably about now that Hartston started to realise the dangers to his position. If, for example, he castled, then black can play his knight out to f6, which threatens knight into g4, with threats against both h2 and f2. This is probably the reason that Hartston panicked with the move d4, and after bishop takes d4, he defended his f2 pawn with queen e2. Unfortunately for him, Mariotti now captured the knight on c3, check, and after b takes c3, White's entire structure is a real mess. The game proceeded with the moves d6, castles by White, and now g5, which is a strong move because it prevents White from ever playing f4, which might activate his pieces. The resulting position is really tremendous for black, who can play bishop d7, castle queenside, and then start routing his knights round to the f4 square with, for example, knight g7, rook over to h8, knight g6, knight d8 to e6, and finally knight into f4. Because white's position is so passive, it's very difficult for him to do anything while black gradually improves his own game. It came as no surprise that Mariotti won convincingly, finally butchering white on the kingside. If after the moves e4, e5, black wants to use one of these attacking formations on the kingside, the most important thing in the early stages is to make sure you strong point the e5 pawn. One opening that does this is the Philidor defence. After knight f3, black plays d6, and after d4 you can play knight out to f6, knight c3, and now protect the e5 pawn with knight bd7. The great Savily Tartakova used to play the Philidor defence with the idea of launching such an attack on the kingside. He would play bishop e7, followed by c6, queen c7, and then later lash out with h6, followed by g5. Black could strengthen this kingside pressure by going perhaps knight f8 over to g6. There's absolutely no theory on this, but here is an example of how it might work out. White most usually develops his bishop on c4, after which black can play bishop e7, and then white's obvious move is to castle kingside, when you can play c6. White might then bring his queen to e2, you can play queen c7, and after he does rook d1, you finally go h6. If white still hasn't cottoned on what you're up to, he might play, for example, h3, preparing to bring his bishop out to e3. But at this moment, you can reveal your plan with g5, and after bishop e3, drop your knight back to f8 to come out to g6. This is exactly the kind of position that black's aiming for, with moves like knight f4 in the offing, and if white captures, then black can take back with the g-pawn and develop pressure on the g-file with rook g8. One of the most famous attacking formations is the Stonewall Dutch, which was used by former world champion Mikhail Botvinnik in his youth, as well as Nigel Short and Artur Yusupov in more recent Grandmaster games. You can use the Dutch against either d4, c4, knight f3, or even g3 or b3. In fact, it's an all-purpose setup. Whatever white does, black plays f5, followed by knight f6, e6, d5, and c6, which sets up a well-nigh impregnable central fortification. Black can choose between putting his king's bishop on the e7 or more aggressive d6 square, and then castle short before gradually inching forward on the kingside. The main problem with the Stonewall formation is this bishop on c8, which at present is shut in by these pawns on f5, e6, d5 and c6. For this reason, I recommend bringing this bishop outside the pawn chain with the manoeuvre bishop d7 to e8 and then bishop out to h5. At club level, the Stonewall formation tends to be devastating because most players have no idea about how to counter it. It can even confound world-class grandmasters, as Sambat Laputin found out to his cost in a game against Valery Salov in Moscow 1987. Laputin opened with his habitual 1d4 move, and Salov replied with f5, the Dutch defence, which probably already came as a slight surprise. Laputin played c4, which is a standard move. Salov brought his knight out to f6, and again Laputin played the usual move g3, getting ready to put this bishop on g2. After e6, bishop g2, Salov erected the stone wall with d5, and after knight f3, further supported this d5 pawn with c6. Laputan castle kingside. Black's bishop came out to the aggressive d6 square. And now white played queen c2, supporting this pawn on c4. Black castled. Laputan brought his knight out to c3. And now Salov started bringing this bishop on c8 round with bishop to d7. One of the accepted strategies in the stone wall, from white's point of view, is to try and exchange off this good d6 bishop for his own bishop on c1, and Laputan now followed this plan by bringing his bishop out to f4. Salov captured it with bishop takes f4, and now gf strengthened white's grip over the e5 square. When Salov continued his bishop manoeuvre with bishop e8, then Laputan played queen b3, attacking this pawn on b7. Now Salov could have defended it with queen e7, but he saw no problem with exchanging queens if white wanted, with queen b6. Laputan didn't particularly fancy this endgame for white, and he played c5, hoping that black would take on b3, after which a takes b3 would give white an open a file. Salov didn't want that, and quietly brought his queen back to c7, hitting this pawn on f4, which white now defended with the move e3. Salov continued developing with knight bd7, and now in order to free up this pawn on b2, Laputan played queen to a3. Finally Salov completed his bishop manoeuvre with bishop out to h5. And now moves like bishop takes f3 come into the reckoning, after which bishop takes f3 could be met by king h8, followed by rook g8 and g5, setting up g-file pressure. White therefore played knight into e5, but after knight takes e5, f takes e5, and now knight e4, white suddenly found himself under quite serious pressure, because moves like f3 are met by knight d2, and if rook f2, black plays knight c4, forking the queen on a3 and this pawn on e3. Suddenly finding himself under serious pressure, Laputan played the move b4, and after knight d2, brought his rook over to c1. Unfortunately for him, the position after knight f3 check, bishop takes f3, and now bishop takes f3, proved to be quite disastrous. Black's light-squared bishop is reputed to be a bad piece in the stone wall formation, but here it's the best piece on the board, and in fact causes white's king terrible problems in the given position. Black threatened simply to bring his queen over to f7 and h5, followed by queen h3 and queen g2 mate. Laputan saw very little to do about this plan, except heading for the hills with his king, and he played king f1, and after queen f7 went knight e2. After the further moves queen g6, knight f4, queen h6, Laputan ran away with his king still further with king e1, leaving this h2 pawn to its fate, and black played queen takes h2. In this position, black is a pawn up with a strong attack, and it's hardly surprising that Salov went on to win. Before we move on to attacking formations with white, I should just mention that against the English opening with c4, it's no problem building up a stonewall Dutch starting with f5, followed by knight f6, e6, d5 and c6, etc. If white should try and adopt the King's Indian attack, with knight f3 on his first move, followed by g3, then black has got a very interesting possibility to set up a stone wall, but without his queen's bishop being locked inside the pawn chain. he can play d5 on his first move, and when white plays g3, immediately develop this bishop on c8 with bishop out to g4. If white now continues with bishop g2, there's the move knight d7, and after castles, black starts to set up the stone wall with e6. A game between Asanov and Shabalov from the 1992 Manila Olympiad continued d3, bishop d6, and after white went c4, black defended this pawn on d5 with c6. White now developed his bishop on c1 with bishop out to e3. Black played knight e7, still waiting. White went queen b3, attacking the pawn on b7. Black defended it with queen b8. It still doesn't look too much like a stonewall formation, but after white played c takes d5, and black recaptured with e takes d5, and then white played his knight out to c3, black castled kingside, and after white's queen a4, black finally played f5, giving us a typical type of stonewall scenario. Black's already got a really good position now, because his next move is going to be f4, starting to lever open white's kingside. You can also use this souped up stonewall formation with the bishop outside the pawn chain when you play the white pieces, and that means setting up the position with d4, c3, bishop out say to g5, and then going knight d2, e3 and f4. After playing d4 on the first move, many white players make the mistake of locking in their queen's bishop with e3 before setting up a stone wall with f4. This will ultimately cost them considerably more time in bringing the bishop outside the pawn chain, so I really don't recommend it. Instead of this, I suggest that whether black plays d5 or knight out to f6, you start out with white by going c3. This move c3 actually has some quite subtle effects, the main one being that it discourages black from going c5, counter-attacking the d4 pawn, because white might just go and take it with d takes c5. Black will now have a terrible job getting back the pawn he carelessly sacrificed. Whether black plays knight out to a6 or e6, white is just going to protect his extra pawn with a move b4. I doubt very much that black has got anything like enough compensation. English Grandmaster David Norwood often plays d4 and after knight f6, c3. And against the Russian woman Grandmaster Svetlana Matveeva in Presswich 1990, after g6 he played his bishop out to g5. After black played bishop g7, he went knight d2. And after d5 he played e3, getting ready to do the stone wall with f4. In this position, Matveeva prematurely gave up a pawn with c5, which Norwood immediately snaffled with dc. In fact, black didn't manage to get this pawn back. She castled, Norwood brought his knight out to f3, black played queen c7, and then white simply defended it with b4. And after black tried to make it into a gambit with b6, there followed bishop f4, hitting the queen on c7. This queen had little choice but to retreat. Black played queen d8, and then after c takes b6, ab, white was simply a pawn to the good. Once white sets up this souped up stonewall formation with his bishop outside the pawn chain on g5, the results can be quite devastating, as the East German IM Thomas Patz found out to his cost against Eduard Meduna from Czechoslovakia. In their game from Trnava in 1986, Pats played b6, Meduna brought out his queen's bishop with bishop g5, and after the moves bishop b7, knight d2, d5, Meduna got ready for his super stonewall with e3, and after knight bd7, unleashed it with f4. I think that Black's best defence is by fianchettoing his king's bishop with g6, which helps secure his king's side. Pats played e6, and after knight gf3, bishop e7, White played bishop d3, bringing his other bishop out to an ideal attacking position. At this time, Black no doubt realised the severe dangers of castling kingside. If he did do that, with castles, White would probably put his knight on an e5, before following up with queen f3, followed by g4. This would really give White a tremendous attacking position. He might even castle queenside, before launching his h-pawn forward as well with h4. I for one wouldn't like to be in Black's shoes one little bit. It was probably the thought of such lines that prompted Pats into lashing out with h6, bishop h4, and now g5. But this self-inflicted gash in his king's side can hardly be a sensible idea. White played calmly bishop g3, and after knight h5, his king's knight went into the struggle with knight e5, incidentally threatening this knight on h5 with the queen on d1. After knight takes e5, fe, Black took White's bishop on g3 off with knight takes g3, and Meduna recaptured hg. But at this moment we see that Black's got this terrible weakness on f7. White's going to play something like queen h5 followed by castle's kingside, and Black will be in all sorts of trouble, which is what prompted Pats to go walkies with his king with king d7. Of course this proved disastrous after White opened up the game with e4, and Black only lasted a total of 24 moves. In the super stonewall, White might also consider bringing his queen out to f3 at one moment. I'll show you what I mean. In a game Klinger against Rigo from the Oberwart Open in 1988, Black played b6 just as in the last game. White developed his bishop on g5, Black went bishop b7, White brought his knight out to d2, and Black went d5. So far everything's quite similar. White played e3, and after knight bd7 played the program move f4. But now, after Black went e6, White first developed his bishop to d3, and after Black played bishop e7, Klinger brought his queen out to f3, which is a very interesting development. One of the ideas of this move is that White securely protects the e4 square, so that Black really can't consider ever going knight e4. If Black castles, White might also bring his queen over to the h3 square, ready to give mate on h7, should he ever manage to rid himself of this knight on f6. As in the previous game, Rigo just didn't dare castle kingside, and he played h6. White captured the knight on f6 with bishop takes f6. After knight takes f6, he brought his king's knight out to the unusual h3 square, and now Black prepared for queenside castling with queen d7, the kingside really being rather uninhabitable. After White castled short, Black castled long, and now White played b4, and after rook dg8 went a4, starting an attack against Black's queenside castled king. It turned out that white's attack was much faster than black's. He's ready to open files immediately with a5. It's hardly surprising that white went on to win. Now let's look at the lines in which black goes g6, which I think is a better defence, but which you're less likely to meet at club level. In a game between the Cuban GM Arancibia and the Indian IM Mithrakanth, played in Calcutta 1988, black first of all went d5, and after white developed his bishop with bishop g5, black defended this knight on f6 with knight bd7. Arancibia brought his own knight out with knight d2, and after g6 announced his super stonewall with f4. Black naturally enough played bishop out to g7, and after e3 tried to set in motion a bit of queenside play with c5. White continued with bishop d3, and after b6 brought his king's knight out with knight gf3. After bishop b7, white's knight on f3 took up residence on the e5 square with knight e5, a typical stonewall manoeuvre. Black castled kingside, white did the same thing, and now black played the rather harmless looking move rook c8, perhaps hoping one day that the c-file would be opened. White meanwhile had bigger fish to fry, and he brought his queen out to f3, continuing a kingside build-up. After black's knight back to e8, white played queen over to h3, threatening this knight on d7. Black defended against this with a move f5, which hopes to keep the kingside closed. Unfortunately, he proved to be disappointed, as white played g4, taking a can opener to black's pawn structure. It's clear that white's unusual move order in the opening has bamboozled black totally, and white went on to win this game with an attack on the g-file. Here we've got another typical super stonewall formation, with black having played g6, and this particular one's from a game between Zurek and Jasnikowski, played in the Czechoslovakian Open in 1992. In this position, white rejected the natural knight gf3, a plan we saw in the last game, and instead adopted the creative queen out to f3. Once again, this development proved to be very effective. After bishop b7, white developed his knight on the e2 square, and then when black went knight back to e8, white played h4. You may be wondering what would happen if black now trapped this bishop with f6. Amongst other things, white could play his queen to h3, whereupon f takes g5 would be effectively answered by h takes g5, uncovering an attack by the queen on h3 against this pawn on h7. Black can't play knight out to f6 because of this pawn on g5, so he'd have to do something desperate like h6. This would hardly be good for black's health, as in addition to g takes h6, white has moves such as bishop takes g6 or queen e6 check, followed by capturing on g6. It's pretty clear that black's kingside is disintegrating very rapidly. Understandably, black rejected this, and instead he tried to prevent white's h5 by playing his knight on d7 to f6. Unfortunately for him, white played h5 anyway, because knight takes h5 is met by the exchange sacrifice rook takes h5, and after gh, queen takes h5, once again black would be in desperate straits. The super stonewall formation, with d4 followed by c3, bishop g5, e3 and f4, is appealing more and more to grandmasters who want to avoid the beaten track. Amongst recent super stonewall converts, we have Nigel Short and Jonathan Spielman, both of whom have used this system very effectively against the computer. Short opened with d4, after which M-Chess Pro replied with knight out to f6, and now short already confused it with the move c3, whereupon it played e6, which I don't think is as good as the move g6. The bishop came out with bishop g5, and after c5, white bolstered the d4 pawn with the move e3. Black fianchettoed his bishop on c8 by first of all going b6, and white developed with knight d2. After black's classical d5, white brought his king's bishop out with bishop d3, and then bishop e7 was met by the super stone wall f4. After black castled kingside and white brought his king's knight out to f3, the computer, interestingly enough, realised the danger of this bishop on d3 and hurried to exchange it off with bishop out to a6. Short complied with bishop takes a6, and after knight takes a6, white castled kingside. The computer continued with knight c7, and now Nigel Short started building up in the centre with knight into e5. The computer played queen d6, and now came the usual attacking move queen over to f3, continuing this kingside build-up. M-Chess Pro went rook fe8, Nigel Short went rook a e1, and after the further moves rook a c8, king h1, a6, it became clear that the computer didn't really have a plan. Nigel Short now launched into the attack with the move g4, gaining a lot of space on the king side. After black's rook b8, white played bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, and now g5, gaining even more space and hitting the bishop on f6. The bishop retreated to e7, and then queen h5 started to put black in all sorts of trouble. The computer fended off the threat to the f7 pawn by going g6. But then queen h6, bishop f8, queen h4 left black really defenceless against the idea of white bringing a rook to f3 and then h3, threatening this pawn on h7 with queen takes h7 mate. Once again we've seen a classic example of the kind of automatic attack white can build up with a super stone wall. It's hardly surprising that M-Chess was forced to resign in just a few moves' time. One of the weaknesses of a computer is it very often doesn't recognise the danger of a slow kingside build-up until it's too late. Perhaps Garry Kasparov would have been well advised to use this setup in his match against Deep Blue. The super stonewall formation also gives white some new possibilities in other openings. The Verasov, for example, with d4, d5 and now knight c3 can be considerably enlivened by playing this f4 formation after knight f6, bishop g5, knight bd7 and now f4. This has become a specialty of the Cuban player Elizart, who's played it with quite a lot of success. White intends to follow up with e3, followed by knight f3, and bishop d3, getting the same kind of attack that we've already seen. Players with a taste for the avant-garde, who might like to wind their opponents up, could also consider the ancient Saragossa opening with c3. If you follow this up with d4 and bishop g5, once again you can get a super stonewall attack. If you play d4 with white, and your opponent tries to get a stonewall in first by going f5, then I actually suggest you try and avoid this possibility with the Staunton Gambit, and a special form of the Staunton which involves an early flank attack. White can play e4, and after f takes e4, go knight c3. Black defends this pawn on e4 by going knight out to f6. And now I like the move g4, trying to displace this knight on f6 by following up with g5. It was Savely Tartakova who first played this line, and his opponent, Mises, went d5, but after g5 had to retreat his knight all the way back to the g8 square. Tartakova sacrificed a pawn with f3, and after e takes f3, queen takes f3, White developed a very strong attack on the f-file and won in just a handful of moves. The recommended treatment of this g4 move is to stop g5 by going h6 with black. But then Bronstein, in a game against Malanyuk in Hastings 1995, played a very subtle treatment with f3 offering a pawn sack, and after d5 he protected this pawn on g4 by going h3 in preparation for the move f takes e4. Malanyuk played c5 almost immediately, but after f takes e4, d takes e4, and now bishop out to e3, Bronstein achieved a small advantage in the endgame, which arose after cd, queen takes d4, and now Malanyuk exchanged queens with queen takes d4, and Bronstein recaptured with a bishop, bishop takes d4. The problem for black in this position is that first of all he's likely to lose this advanced pawn on e4, and he then has a remaining isolated pawn on e7, which could also come under pressure later in the game. After the move f3, black should be careful not to capture this pawn, as after e takes f3, white can go bishop d3, suddenly threatening bishop g6 mate. Although black can avoid that, he'd nevertheless come under a tremendous assault by white's pieces, with his king floating around in the centre. I'm going to leave you now with another example of this g4 idea, which proves so dangerous against the Staunton gambit, and in this case it may well be the refutation of black's defence. The so-called Clarendon court opening, with c5, d5, f5, has been popularised recently by British Grandmaster Jonathan Levitt, but unfortunately it may well be refuted by e4, f takes e4, knight out to c3, and after knight f6, g4, with the idea of going g5. Black should now play h6, as recommended by Levitt himself, but then Julian Hodgson's fascinating suggestion of f4 may be black's undoing. White wants to play g5 once again, and e takes f3 on pass-on can once again be met by bishop out to d3, threatening bishop g6 mate. This seems to me to be a case of the Clarendon being caught napping. The lines I've shown you on this video will strike terror into the hearts of your opponents. I guarantee that they won't like the taste of cold steel.